Oxford. Hira's research focuses on early diagnosis of cancer through blood-based tests. Hira is also the graduate academic officer at the Oxford University Islamic Society. We have Imran Naved. Imran is currently pursuing his DPhil within the hypersonics group at the Oxford Thermofluids Institute at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on the application of transpiration cooling as a thermal protection system for wing leading edges. We also have Fatima, who is a second-year student doing a DPhil in cybersecurity at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Oxford. And we have Hibba, who is a fourth-year part-time PhD student in human geography, focusing on consumption and slaughter in the British halal meat industry. We have 40 minutes for the panel, and then we have questions at the end. So I will pass over now to Imran. Imran, please do kick us off. So what is your experience like as a PhD? And what exactly is a PhD, and how is it different from taught courses?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Really nice to be joining this event, and thank you for inviting me to speak as well. So just a bit more like of a background of myself, just very quickly. I'm finally a PhD student now, so I've kind of spent a few years. Finally, I'm meaning fourth-year PhD student now at Oxford. So I spent a few years kind of getting through the whole PhD experience, and then before that, I also did a master's and my undergraduate at Oxford as well. So my kind of PhD experience, I guess, is a little bit different to many of you who would be kind of doing detailed research proposals and doing an undergrad at one place and then going for a PhD at a different university. I've kind of stayed at the same place the whole time. In terms of the PhD itself, I like to think of the PhD, and a lot of people will say this, as like an extended training program. Essentially, in many ways, the work that you do, the outcomes that you do in the PhD, a lot of the time you'll find, especially when you get to the end of the PhD, that I could have done this in a year, or I could have done this in a year and a half. But the real kind of important part of the PhD is the training that you get with your supervisor, essentially going through how to do literature reviews, how to read the literature on the subject, how to come up with hypotheses, and then actually experimentally test these hypotheses according to the at least in my case, the scientific method, and then come up with reasonable conclusions and figuring out what future work could be done as well. So that's kind of essentially what the PhD is, and a lot of my time, especially my first 2 years, was spent doing work that I'm not necessarily going to write about in my thesis, but it actually, helped me massively in kind of the formative development of my PhD itself. So that's kind of the kind of main difference, really, in my mind, at least, between a PhD and, for example, a master's, where in a master's, you might do, a bit of research, you might do a short thesis, but you won't have to do anywhere near the kind of rigorous application of kind of doing original research all the way from the beginning, from the literature side of things, and then developing this project all the way throughout for like 3 or 4 years, and coming out with a thesis at the end. And was there another part of your question? Sorry, I didn't catch the first part again.
So the main discussion points is what exactly is a PhD and how is it different from taught courses? I myself have not done a PhD, so I'm very much curious, as are many other people in this conference. So some questions could be, when is the right time to do a PhD? What is the timeline of a PhD like? And what's it like on a day-to-day life of doing a PhD? What are some reasons to do a PhD and reasons to not do a PhD? So it would be great if all the panelists can, share their wealth of experiences.
So I think I'll elaborate on one more point, and then I'll hand it over to the other panelists to kind of give in their little comments. But I think the point that you made there about like when is it right to do a PhD and when it's not right to do a PhD, I think for me is, again, a bit of a different experience to many of you, in that I essentially just fell into doing a PhD, because at least the way the course is structured in Oxford is that in your master's, you do an extended research project in your final year, which counts for essentially half of your final year course at Oxford. And as part of that research project, I got to know my current supervisor very well, and he essentially made me an offer, halfway through the research program, that there's a PhD for you that you can do if you're interested. And I think one of the things that didn't really dawn to me very much when I made this kind of choice to do a PhD is essentially the opportunity cost, in that you're essentially sacrificing 3 or 4 years of your life, right at where you're probably going to be one of most, or if not the most productive in your kind of career as well. So the early 20s are the time where a lot of people would kind of move very, very swiftly up the career ladder, and you're essentially sacrificing that time to pursue this very, very long program, which is going to be very tough, and you're going to find it difficult to keep motivation throughout this entire PhD program. So I think the one thing I would really recommend for anybody who's considering doing a PhD is to have your goals very, very clearly in your mind. Why am I doing this exactly, and how is this going to help me in your future career? And obviously you can ask questions about this, But if it's literally just a case of, oh yeah, I can't be bothered to apply for a job, or I'm applied to apply for a job, but I can't get a job immediately, that's not really a good reason to spend 4 years doing a PhD, where you'll be spending a lot of time really questioning, why am I doing this? And the only thing that's going to keep you going is your passion and interest for the research topic that you're doing. That's all I have to say. I think I'll hand over to the other panelists to make any comments.
Fantastic. Let's address the question to everyone, and the panelists are most welcome to each share their experiences on the individual questions. So let's move on to Fatima next. Assalamu alaikum, Fatima.
Sorry, walaikum assalam. Yep. So I guess I'll go on. So I'll introduce myself a little bit as well, like Imran did. So I'm probably quite different to most of the panelists here. I was applying for PhDs while I was still in my undergrad. So I was in the final year of my undergrad, and I kind of knew that I didn't want to go into industry. So I was doing computer science, and I think for us at least, the first step on the career ladder is always some kind of development role where you're doing the same code for a while, and I didn't want to really do that, and I was more interested in kind of research itself. So I started applying for PhDs, and I applied for 3 different types of PhDs, and the program that I'm in Oxford is a 4-year program where the first year was training, so it gave me some room to kind of learn a little bit more about my field and understand which kind of topics I was more interested in, and allow me to tailor my research proposal more around those. So it gave me a little bit more freedom to kind of see what I wanted to do my PhD in. And so yeah, that's why it's my 3rd year of the PhD, but it's the 2nd year of my research. And like Imran said, like the PhD, it's really different to taught courses, because you're very much in control of the flow of your own work, which, as much as it sounds like an advantage, it can also be quite daunting, because I think especially in the first year or so, it's quite hard to come up with this novel idea that you can explore and that is contributing to the field in some way. So yeah, that can be a little bit daunting at first, but it's alhamdulillah, once you realize how you want to contribute to the field, it's really, really interesting, and it's just such a great way to learn and further your own knowledge about this field and just get to know so many great people. So yeah, that's kind of what I want to say around that. I'll let the others speak for a bit.
I can jump in now with my experience. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for asking me to come and speak. So on the first point about how a PhD differs from a taught course, I did experience this transition quite rapidly, having gone from doing a taught course, MSc, and then the next year straight into a PhD, similar to Imran's trajectory. We actually started as undergrads in Oxford in the same year together, so we've had quite a similar experience in that sense. So I would echo what other people have said already. So it's more independent. You've got to be more self-motivated and self-directed. Perhaps this is different in different disciplines, because if you're working as part of a research team, maybe you'll also be it'll be more group directed. But certainly in my experience in the social sciences, it's your project. And the other feeling that I experienced when going into a PhD was more of a sense of personal responsibility for designing the project. So I would be contacting people for fieldwork saying, I'd like to interview you. And I was the one who was responsible for designing the project. So yes, that's also empowering, but there's also a sense of responsibility that comes with that. And I would say that because I'm doing a part-time PhD, so I'm talking more in the context of 6 to 8 years rather than 3 to 4 years, which is a very, very long time. And I hope I don't take that long to finish. But within that time, much of it has not just been what directly will go into the thesis write-up, but my other opportunities to contribute to my academic and personal development. So I've tried as much as possible to make the most of this time attending conferences, attending seminars put on by the department, taking the opportunity to present my work where possible. So in that sense, it's as much as you make of it. If you chase opportunities and put your name out there, you can do other things. One of the things that's been the most effective in contributing to my personal development is getting involved in undergraduate teaching, which was extremely daunting at the beginning, and it still is, but slightly less so now. But I only got to do that because I put myself out there and I told people, if there are any teaching opportunities, get in touch. So then when they did arise, I took the opportunity to do that. And now I'm trying to push myself further by getting involved in master's teaching. Yeah, so all that to say, if you are doing a PhD, it's not just about what ends up in your write-up, but other opportunities within those 3 to 4 years or 6 to 8 years, however long, other opportunities that you can seize whilst you're in that university environment.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a bit more on how a PhD is different from a taught course. So essentially it helps to think of it that, you know, when you're in a taught course, you are being taught knowledge that is already sort of known. But when it comes to a PhD, you are trying to generate knowledge and you are trying to find the missing gaps within knowledge. So essentially what happens is you spend 3 to 4 years really focused on a research question. It's something that will not be known or will not be proven. So for example, in the sciences, it could be something very specific, like how does this protein act in a cell? And this isn't known yet. So what you have to then do is spend those 3 to 4 years designing experiments, reading around, testing your hypotheses, and then basically filling that gap in the knowledge. So that's essentially how it's different. You know, you're not being taught, you are generating that knowledge. You are trying to find that knowledge. And there might be some taught elements during the PhD. So you might have some kind of lectures, seminars. This differs depending on the program you're in. But mainly the idea is that you are the one generating knowledge, and that's what goes into your thesis. And then you can publish that work. So then it becomes actual knowledge that can then be taught to others. So essentially that's what happens. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about what is a PhD and how that's different.
Fantastic, thank you all very much. So it sounds like a PhD is different to other taught courses in the sense that you're very much independent, you very much have free reign over what you do in your 3 years as a PhD student. And I love that phrase, generate knowledge. Yes, and that's fantastic. So it's just an announcement to everyone. I'm sure you have a lot of questions based on what you've just heard, but can you please direct them to me? And then at the end of the panel discussion, you'll go through the questions with the panel. So the next question which I'd like to address to the whole panel is, when is the right time to do a PhD? Is it straight after a taught course, or is it better to perhaps do some year in the industry, gain some practical experience, and then go on to do a PhD, thereby implementing what you've learned in the industry? So feel free, guys, to just jump in and answer the question.
So maybe I can jump in first, actually, because I think for engineering, it's a bit different doing a PhD compared to other subjects because it's such a vocational degree anyway. And a lot of people, you know, you might ask the question, what's the point of even doing a PhD in engineering? Because the idea of engineering, at least when you think about it, is, you know, applying the physics and maths kind of skills that we already know into these kind of very practical problems, right? And essentially the way, just to kind of talk about engineering PhDs in general, the way I think about engineering PhDs is that you're essentially doing like fundamental engineering. So at least in my context, for example, I'm looking at kind of developing spacecraft technology. You know, how do we ensure that spacecraft and rockets that come back to Earth survive? You know, how do we ensure that they're protected, and how can we increase the amount of payload and the amount of, you know, stuff that we can take to other places in the solar system cheaper and faster, essentially. So for engineering PhD, it's kind of looking at those fundamental questions and not necessarily designing the vehicle that's going to go there, but answering specific questions that will help us get to that stage. And especially in engineering PhDs, it's very, very common that people would do, for example, they will do PhDs in industry itself part-time whilst they're working, or they might come back later after working for 5-6 years. And there isn't really a right answer to this question, because the advantage of doing a PhD straight after your undergrad is that you're still very young, you still haven't decided on like a particular career. And you know, by doing a PhD, you get to a stage where potentially you can come in at a higher level, especially if you're interested in the research side of industry, because especially in engineering, at least in my field, there's lots of opportunities where you can go directly into like fundamental research in industry. And for a lot of those positions, you need a PhD already. So from that perspective, doing a PhD straight away is really great. On the other hand, if you're not really sure you want to go into research, or you're interested in research, but not like super interested in research, then it's a good idea to go into industry first, and then explore opportunities within the company itself of potentially doing a PhD whilst you're working, or taking some time out, you know, halfway through your career. When you feel like you need a break, you can take a PhD and then come back. So there are a few options depending on your personal circumstance.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to think about, you know, what your purpose is to do a PhD, and then also when is a good time. A good time is when you're ready, sort of, or you feel relatively ready to do. And I know that's very subjective and it's very elusive, but for example, for me, when I was doing my undergrad, I already had 2 research experiences, and most of the times that's enough experience for you to then start a PhD. So my personal advisor would suggest, like he was suggesting, you know, just apply straight to a PhD, just do it. You have the experience, you have the capability, you could do it. But I didn't want to. I didn't feel ready at that time, because I wanted to spend a year doing a master's so that I have even more research experience, because in my mind I had a certain level of experience that I wanted before I started the PhD. And then also I wanted to spend a bit more time studying the cancer field in more depth, which I felt I couldn't do in my undergraduate research course. So even though other people around me were saying that I was ready, it's really about evaluating yourself, whether you really do feel ready and what you want and what your goals are. So just, I guess, try and think about that and really gain clarity. And then the other is when it makes sense for you to do a PhD, because, you know, are you at a stage in your life where you can set aside 3 to 4 years for this, you know, considering that it is a full-time job most of the time, unless you do it part-time. But if you do it full-time, you will have to give up your job. So, you know, weigh and balance that financial cost to you. And also, are you at a stage in your career maybe where you feel that unless you have a PhD, you can't really progress anymore? So really you need to consider what you're gaining from the PhD and how that fits into your timeline.
Yeah. Similarly, I would say it's balancing act of thinking about work experience versus academic experience. From my personal journey, I went straight to a PhD after my undergraduate and master's. And I was at that point where I didn't really have much work experience at all. Having finished my master's, I hadn't, apart from an internship here and there, I hadn't really gotten any real world experience. So perhaps it wasn't the right time for me to go into a full-time PhD, and then by the time I would have been finished with that, and then perhaps I wanted to go into a job, maybe I'd feel really disconnected and too siloed in academia, which partly contributed towards my decision to do the PhD part-time. And certainly some of the funders that I spoke to fund my PhD said, we feel you need a bit of work experience so that you can be more effective in your PhD. So I suppose I compromised and tried to have the best of both worlds by doing it part-time and trying to find work at the same time. But if it was me going into a full-time PhD, I personally probably it would have been better for me to take a year or two out to do a bit of work and then come back to studying with fresh eyes. So yeah, it depends on those kinds of factors.
So I'll just build on, I agree with like what everyone else said. I think it's quite subjective of when you'd actually want to do the PhD. Like for instance, I had done 2 research projects, well, kind of research-based projects over the summer at my during my undergrad, and I kind of knew that that was the direction I wanted to go in. I wasn't really that interested in going straight into industry. So and I just felt like if I had gone with applied to a master's first, I would have just been, it wouldn't have given me the room to actually explore my research interests as much. And so I just thought there was no harm in applying to do a PhD. I didn't think I was going to get in, and at that point I would have probably started applying for masters, but I got in, so I thought that this is now a chance for me to really explore my own research interests and pursue my own kind of interests within this field. But the on one hand, I do feel like there was, if I had done something like a master's, I would have gotten a little bit more experience, and I wouldn't have felt so much like, you know, I would have had more experience in academic writing or actually critiquing academic literature and stuff, which I think masters gives you room to do. But because my program had that year of training, I got to get some experience, so it wasn't all too difficult. But again, I guess it depends on circumstance and the nature of your program as well. Yeah, if you're ready to do a PhD, then there's nothing that can really stop you from doing it.
That's fantastic. I really like how there is a diversity in this panel. We have some part-time PhD students and full-time PhD students from different backgrounds, but it sounds like the consistent theme really is down to you. Are you ready? And do you know what you want to get out of the PhD? And at the same time, it comes down to balancing your studies alongside your own personal life as well. So it takes a lot of personal self-reflection, it looks like, by the sounds of it. We are getting a lot of questions, and that is fantastic. Very much looking forward to going through these at the end of the panel. So the next question to the panel is, what is the timeline of a PhD like? And what is the day-to-day life of a PhD student? I know, Hira, you touched on this a little bit, but it would be fantastic if the panel could go into a bit more depth about all of this.
So the timeline, as I mentioned, it's usually 3 to 4 years. What happens usually is that in your first year, you are a probationary research student. And so after year 1, at least here in Oxford, you have something called a transfer of status viva, and you have to write a report, and you have to pass that to then be a confirmed PhD student. Then you continue on with your research, and in your year 3, you have to do what is called a confirmation of status. So that is another viva that you then have to pass. And once you pass that, then you're ready to submit your thesis. And you don't really have exams or anything as part of your PhD. These are the main milestones, and your assessment is usually through presentations in your lab or departmental seminars and publications. So that's essentially what you have to do, and not really sit any exams. Day to day, it depends on the field. So for me, because I'm in the biological sciences, essentially you spend a lot of time in the lab. Again, you are in charge of your own time. You can go in when you want, leave when you want, mostly. I mean, supervisors are fine, but that also means that you have to be very careful and very aware of how you spend your time, because there's nobody to really check up on you, whether you're working 9 to 5 every single day. So there may be periods of your PhD where you haven't done any work in a week because there's really nobody, you're not expected to attend certain classes or anything like that. And then there might be times where you have put no restriction on yourself and you are in the lab at midnight and you overwork and you burn out. So, you know, day to day varies depending on you. You are completely in charge of your time, but that's really something to be conscious of. And then if you're a bioinformatician, for example, and you do more computational work, then you can even work from home and you don't have to go into labs. So again, lots of flexibility.
No, go ahead, Imran.
All right, okay. Yeah, so I think kind of mirroring very closely to what Hira just mentioned, at least in my field, so again, it really depends on whether you're doing an experimental or a computational PhD. At least in my lab, everyone who's been doing experimental PhDs has ended up spending at least 4 years to finish their PhD, sometimes 4.5 years. Just because I think the standard rule in experiments is that everything that can go wrong will go wrong. So you always end up spending a lot longer doing your experiments than you initially plan. I think similar to this, again, because it's more of an experimental PhD, it will depend massively lab to lab. But like, if I'm thinking about like a timeline of like a day-to-day, my supervisor has like certain expectations. So he likes like his PhD students to come into the lab by 8:30, 9 a.m. every day. This is before COVID. So you know, obviously COVID has changed things massively, but in a normal day, it would be like, you know, 8:30, 9 a.m. He'd expect all of his students, and there's like 10 or 15 of us PhD students in the lab for this one supervisor. And then he'd expect us to stick around until 5 p.m. generally. We could leave early if you have other commitments or anything. And then oftentimes, I think we end up working longer hours than we need to. And oftentimes we'd end up staying until 6, 7 p.m. most days. And then sometimes even coming in on Saturdays, Sundays, depending on, you know, where the experiments are and, you know, if those experiments require you to do more time. But what's really nice about this is that it essentially becomes very similar to like a 9 to 5 job. And for a lot of us, it's like that. Like we'd work on our PhDs from 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, come home, and then we don't have to think about that until the next day. So if you can keep that type of schedule, it actually becomes really manageable, and you're not kind of in this weird situation of thinking about a PhD at odd hours, but also having all the time free, which is not great, because even though it looks like you've got lots of free time, you're still thinking about your PhD all the time. But that's all I have to say. Yeah.
In terms of the timeline that Imran and Hira have already spoken about, yeah, the part-time one is basically that times 2. So if for the full-time degree you do the transfer of status in your first year, a part-time course, you've got 2 years to do it, and everything is proportionally double in theory. But as I said, I don't know if I want to work up to the 6 years. I'm trying to finish it in less time than that, but theoretically that's how it works. Personally, in terms of day-to-day life, I generally break it up by weeks, by the week. So if there's 5 working days, I'd be spending about 3 days on the PhD and then 2 days working, but it depends each week what that work is. Sometimes it's undergraduate teaching, sometimes I'm doing research assistant work. But yeah, it's about 3 days on the PhD. And because it's in the social sciences, and this is probably the case for the humanities as well, it's much less structured. There aren't certain hours that have to be in a lab. It's more just, okay, you need to be writing or you need to be doing field work. So at the moment I'm in the writing stage, but when I was in the fieldwork stage, those 3 days a week would be spent going and visiting farms or slaughterhouses, carrying out interviews, recruiting people, designing surveys, transcribing. So yeah, that's generally how I break up my time. But as I said, it's much less structured, with the exception of certain weekly seminars in the department that I attend. But other than that, there aren't specified contact hours.
All right, fantastic. So thank you, everyone. So we have 10 minutes left. So we'll go on to the next question. And that is, how do you choose the correct supervisor, and how do you choose the right field, the right project, and the right lab? So it'll be great if all the panelists can please provide very succinct, sharp answers, although your responses have been amazing so far, just for the sake of time, please.
I think I'll go first. So choosing a supervisor, I think that is a very, very important decision, and you should definitely not take that lightly. It's not highlighted enough because just the way your supervisor is and what they can provide for you is exceptionally important for how well your PhD goes. So the way it works is you are doing your own research project, but you're in a lab, and your supervisor is literally, you know, one of the very few people responsible for you. And so that relationship is going to be key. And so I think one thing to really think about is whether they're actually a nice person, and how do you find that out? You know, you do meet with them and speak to them and just see if you actually get on with them on a personal level. Because if you have to report to them every week and you have to work so closely with them every week, it will get really hard if you just don't get along well. And also speak to other people in the lab to generally find out what kind of supervisor is he, and others in the department as well, because some supervisors they have a reputation for being monstrous and making people cry, and you really don't want that to affect your PhD. The other really important thing to consider is figure out what your preferred style of supervision is. Do you like someone who is very involved in your project and very sort of hands-on, you know, micromanaging almost, and you know, you like that pressure being applied on you? Or are you on the other extreme where you really want to be very independent and you want to be the one driving your research project and you want very minimal input from your supervisor day to day? So both of these things have their own pros and cons. Just figure out what it is that you like, and that, you know, you can figure that out through research experience or just working in the lab a little bit before your PhD, a couple months doing some internships, anything like that. The other thing, I know you said succinct, but it's a very important thing, I think. And so the other thing is their own research experience, you know, that supervisor's research experience, and can they guide you in the field that you're actually in? Can they provide you with the knowledge and the skills and the techniques? Because your supervisor might be a really nice person, but you also have, you know, if they can't really guide your research project and they don't know anything about it, then they're not the ideal supervisor either. So I guess, yeah, those would be the things I would say.
Yep, I agree with what Hira said. There's just a couple of other things that I think are also important to consider. So one of them is, what are your plans either after doing your PhD? Are you wanting to stay in academia? Do you want to go into industry and such? Because there are certain supervisors who have better links within industry, and there are certain supervisors who have better links within, you know, the top tier journals, and just have a better kind of research publication rate, and you might want to work in that group more. Other things to consider are if they're interested in the same kind of research interests that you have, because again, they'll have the relevant contacts that you'd need for either interviews or such, and they'd also have relevant, they'd also be aware of like the relevant conferences that you could be applying for, so that you could create your own network connections. And then, yeah, and again, like Hira said, like you don't necessarily have to work in the group to get an idea. You can also speak to the students that are currently being supervised by those lecturers. I know that I've been told by quite a few before I chose my supervisor that, yeah, you don't want to go here because they're not the best supervisor. So yeah, speaking to current students of those supervisors is really important as well, to get an idea of how they work, and to see if that's how you'd be comfortable working as well.
So to echo what Fatima said, I would say, yeah, speak to previous or current students that are supervised by that person. Usually you can find that on the website of the academic, at least in my department, so speak to them. I also think it's good to contact lots of potential supervisors. I mean, personally, I just reached out to lots and lots of people, and that helped me understand what I was looking for. Because some of them take themselves out of the running, either by not replying or they speak to you. And some people told me straight up, your work isn't, as in, I'm not interested in supervising your work, or we're not compatible. So that helps you understand what kind of research interests your supervisor should have. And yeah, so just, I would say contact lots of people, lots of potential people.
And if I was going to add one final thing, I think the other panelists have kind of answered very extensively on this question. But I think the one final thing I'll add is that it depends on your own experience. So if you're, I think if you're talking about, if you're a PhD student who's a bit more experienced, who's done work in industry before and you need less supervision, then, and your aim is to get into academia or to get publications, I think a lot of the time what you find is that the supervisors who are world-renowned are going to be super busy and might only give you like time once a month or once every 3 months, or very little time, and you have a lot of independent work. So if you're kind of more confident independently and you want to get lots of publications out of your PhD and kind of develop your academic career, then maybe that's the way to go. Or on the other hand, if you're an inexperienced PhD student, then you want someone who's a lot more hands-on, who's maybe only got 1 or 2 PhD students, and you have some confidence that you'll be able to see maybe every single day or several times a week, and they'll be able to really guide you in those kind of formative periods. So that's the other thing to consider, how many PhD students they have and whether they will be able to give you that time.
That's fantastic, thank you. So we have reached the end of the panel discussion, and we have received a lot of questions. But the most common question is, of course, about funding. What are the costs that are associated with a PhD? And how do you fund your PhD? How do you fund your project? And how is that different to doing a part-time PhD? So perhaps let's start off with Hira.
Yeah, so costs, basically you have a tuition fee. Then if you apply to Oxford or Cambridge and you're an international student, you also have to pay what is a college fee. And I think normally that adds up to about £30,000 per year. But what happens is if you get a fully funded place, then your tuition fee will be covered, your college fee will be covered, and on top of that, you will actually get a stipend to help with your living costs. And mostly in the UK, that's about 15,000 per year for students. And the most I've seen is about 21,000, which some research councils provide their students. So it's, you don't always have to pay through a PhD. It's actually very common for most people doing a PhD to have a funded position rather than paying it themselves and then getting a stipend as well. Funding opportunities are different if you are from the UK or if you're an international student. There are far more funding opportunities for UK-based students simply because the research councils run from usually tax or charity money, and so they can only use that to fund UK-based students. And then for international students, either most people get some kind of funding from their home countries. Sometimes, they will have some other private institution or industry or their previous workplace funding their degree. But also for each university, you will also have like a centralized university system where there are scholarships and they will fund international students. But of course, that's generally not something to rely on because they are incredibly competitive. You can imagine just getting onto a PhD program is hard enough. And then to find funding, that's another layer of competition. So yeah, I would say it is quite difficult as an international student, but definitely try with your government and your home countries because that is probably your best bet.
Okay, are there any other panelists who would like to answer the question? Because if not, we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so I'd just like to make an announcement that this conference is recorded, so it will be available to everyone. And another question that we've received from the audience is, should the master's research be directly related to what you foresee researching for a DPhil? Should there be some sort of consistency between your master's and your PhD? So I'd like to, perhaps we can have, go on Imran, you can answer that one.
Yeah, because this is a yeah, I think this is one of the questions that cropped up very quickly for me, because my master's project was whilst it was related, it was nothing to do with what I ended up doing my PhD, just because at least my PhD topic, like that general topic, we don't actually study it in undergraduate courses at all. I think there's a few master's modules or something in some universities, but it's not very common studying, you know, aerothermodynamics, which is kind of the field that I'm studying at the moment. And essentially, there doesn't really have to be relations. I know of people who've done undergraduates in like sciences and then moved to humanities for their masters and ended up doing like their PhDs in something in the humanities, like history or social sciences. So you can actually move massively. It's all about kind of, ultimately for a PhD, it's not really about how much knowledge you have necessarily, but it's about whether you have the research skills and whether you have the kind of passion to study that field. So if you can demonstrate that and you can convince your supervisor of that fact, then, you know, the only person you have to convince your supervisor, and as long as they accept you, at least in UK universities, then you're into the PhD program, and all that remains is getting funding.
Yeah, I agree completely with what Imran said. It genuinely doesn't need to be that related whatsoever. I mean, I didn't do a master's either, and I remember even when I was applying to do PhDs, I applied to 3 PhDs in very, very different different research areas. One thing that might help is just like playing up the skills that you have learned from whatever you have. So it doesn't have to be related to that particular field. It might just be that you know, you came across this particular idea while you were studying something else, but then it triggered your interest in this, and then after that you're just trying to play up any kind of skills that would help you within your within your research, like Imran said. So yeah, it doesn't have to be subject related to your PhD.
Okay, if there are no more responses from the panel, we'll move on to the next question. So the next question is more about age. Do you think there is an age limit for when you should do a PhD? Do you think that PhDs are slightly different for mature students coming back from the industry compared to those going straight into a PhD? I know we've slightly glossed over this, but it is a recurring question from the audience. Is there essentially an age limit for a PhD?
I mean, theoretically, there isn't. I've heard of people doing PhDs when they're 80, so, you know, there is no age limit per se. And the earliest, I guess, you could do it is after your undergrad. But I think the experience would be quite different for people coming back from industry into academia, just because they might not be so aware of the research skills that go on into doing a PhD. So they might have a very steep learning curve, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. So, you know, I guess that's really all I wanted to say. There's no age limit at all.
Fantastic. Thank you for clarifying that. Right. So another question we're getting is, how do I decide on an area of research for my PhD, especially when I have interdisciplinary interests in the humanities? So how do you essentially refine all these different interests and decide, okay, from all of these interests, what do I focus on exactly? So Hibba, would you like to take on that question?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think maybe this is a bit of a, yeah, because in my experience, maybe this is because I'm in a geography department which is highly interdisciplinary. I'm in the fortunate position where I'm researching something really quite specific, but there are lots of other parts of the discipline and other disciplines I find really interesting, but I'm always interacting with those topics every day, whether I'm attending seminars in the department or I'm teaching on a completely different topic. So I suppose you've got to think about what your interests are and free yourself from the idea that everything that interests you, you have to do a PhD in, because there are some things that are interesting, but you don't necessarily want to spend 3 to 4 years on them. And the good thing about doing a PhD is you're in that university environment, and I've got lots of opportunities to explore my other interests, even though I'm not studying them. Yeah, so if you can get a teaching role as well, that really forces you to do that, where you have to teach a variety of different things that aren't in your wheelhouse but are really interesting. And yeah, so that's my answer.
Yeah, I guess it sounds like there are lots of different things you have to consider when you do decide what you want to research for your PhD. You have to research what are you interested in, what resources are available, what kind of supervisor is available, whether this is something which is beneficial as well for the community. So it sounds like there are lots of different criteria there for you to choose from. And it would be great for the panel to perhaps see, how do you balance all of these different influences, and how do you then use that to refine what to choose for your PhD research? So let's go on, Hira.
Sure. So essentially, I think in terms of interest, sometimes it's very easy to get very bogged down with exactly what research question you want to work in. You know, especially like in biology, there's so many different things that you could be interested in. How do you decide what to dedicate, 3 to 4 years of your life to? But I think in general, if this is an area you are interested in, so for me, for example, within cancer, I was just interested in epigenetics, and there were 3 different epigenetics labs. And I knew that it wouldn't really matter that much which exact lab I would go in terms of like the research question, because you can't really know that well, because it's so specific. It's such a specific question. You can't really know before you're actually doing the PhD. So in like overall, just have a general sort of interest in the field. It can be as broad as cancer. I just want to work in cancer, and it doesn't really matter that much how specific it is, but make sure that you have some sort of skills that you bring to that PhD that will help you in that field. And you also have some skills or techniques that you would like to gain from that PhD. Also that the field has some sort of relevance to your career. Also, it also helps if the field is generally like an up and coming field or like a popular field, because then there will be more funding, there will be more interest. You will also have better career prospects. If you go with something that's completely obsolete and just been done over and over again and nobody's really interested in it, then that's not really a good area to be in. And yeah, you can also, because once you do your PhD, you don't actually have to stick to that exact thing afterwards, even if you stay within academia. So essentially what you want to do is get the best training. And so that's also why it's not that crucial, like the specificities of it are not so crucial.
I did just want to jump in a little bit on the interdisciplinary part. So my research is very interdisciplinary, where I'm using like computational methods, but I use a lot of insight from social sciences. And one thing that will really help is choosing a research group that is able to like apply lots of insights from various disciplines. So speaking with your supervisor and kind of seeing how your research, their research group kind of conducts their research and stuff, just to know if they're open to the idea of like collaborations between across different disciplines. And then in addition to that, you don't have to like, even if you have, I guess my research is a little bit different to the other panelists, because my research question was less specific and a little bit more broad. But yeah, you can always, just if you're using insights from different disciplines doesn't mean that, it's not going to contribute anything. I think one thing to really focus on while you're doing this research is knowing how it's contributing to your field. So if you're like, say, if you're doing a PhD in cybersecurity, what is your research going to contribute to cybersecurity in general? And that's a good way of like making sure that you have some focus within this interdisciplinary research.
So we have a question which is more tailored to Hibba. So for the humanities, does taking on undergraduate teaching automatically make one's PhD a part-time one?
No, but I definitely think it's easier for me to manage the teaching load because I am part-time. But that being said, there are plenty of full-time PhD students who have a very similar teaching load to me. And I don't necessarily see it as, because I know there's the tendency to see teaching as something that takes you away from your research, but in my experience, it's helped me understand my topic better, even if it's something slightly not in the same exact area. But yes, that's definitely, it is a big time commitment, but that doesn't stop people from finishing the PhD in a full-time timeline. But yeah, it's definitely easier for me and more enjoyable to do teaching because it's part-time, but you don't have to.
Fantastic, thank you. So we previously mentioned about how we can essentially have free reign over our PhD, and it is very much a decision of what you want to get out of this and what is available. The question is from the audience, what is the best way to plan out your 3 to 4 years if you are on a PhD program? There is this aspect of your control over the PhD program, but to what extent is that? Can you actually possibly plan out the next 3 to 4 years and stick to that plan? So perhaps, Imran, would you like to take on that question?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it really depends on your field and what your topic is. So I think my answer is going to be kind of almost related to a question that's actually on the chat, which is somebody was asking, like, can you suit your PhD towards your supervisor's interests? And I think my answer to this question is also going to be related to that, in that, at least for me, I didn't have a specific question in mind necessarily, and I didn't write a research proposal for my PhD. Like it was a bit more ad hoc and informal, where I kind of approached my supervisor, we had a chat, and essentially, at least for my field, a PhD program requires a lot. It's not just the funding for your stipend and for your tuition fees, but it requires a lot more money than that to actually run the kind of very expensive experimental facilities that we need to get good experimental data out of a PhD. So it's almost impossible, or it's very rare that you'll be able to come up with a question and convince your supervisor to essentially get 500K, 600K's worth of funding for you to investigate that question. A lot of the time, what ends up actually happening is that there are some topics which are of interest to industry and to the research programs, and then you have to join that, and that's what happened to me. So essentially, because that's how I ended up joining my PhD program, my supervisor, we had a chat at the beginning, and like his kind of methodology, and I kind of agree with that, is that it's very hard to plan everything out from the very beginning, but you can plan things out after your first year. So the first year ends up being this kind of very much exploratory phase where you kind of know what your question is going to be, at least in my field. And then you spend that time trying to figure out, okay, we know what the general question is going to be, but we don't know how I'm going to contribute to answering that question. And I haven't designed my experiments. I haven't done the literature review, right? But once you get to that stage, and once you get to the end of that and you get to the transfer of status, then one of the things that you have to do for your transfer of status is give the external examiners confidence that you're going to be able to finish the PhD and you know what you're doing. And so at that point, you come up with a Gantt chart, you come up with a really decent plan. And obviously that plan will change over time, but once you have a plan, then you can structure the PhD and you'll know, okay, this will take me 3.5 years, 4 years to finish this. So that's kind of what
Any other panelists? If not, we'll go into the next question. Okay, so we have a great question from a member of the audience. How does doing a PhD impact your mental health, and what support is out there for your mental health during a PhD? So Fatima, would you like to take this question, please? Starting off with Fatima.
Yeah, so I guess it depends. It's quite subjective, but that being said, especially jumping from a talk course, it is a bit of a jump, because you're suddenly in a lot more control over how much work you're conducting and how productive you're being. And there are times when it can, when like you take advantage of it and you won't do as much work and then think, okay, I'll push it back to this week. And it can have a knock-on effect on the rest of your research. And then there are days when you're like crying because nothing's working out, and there are other days when everything is working out and it looks great. So it's a mix of both ways, but I will say that generally speaking, universities and departments provide a lot of support. If you're having like a hard time with like not achieving your results, and again, I guess it really depends on the supervisor that you picked. If you have a very good relationship with your supervisor and he's someone that and there's someone that's very understanding towards your workload and stuff, then they're going to provide a lot of support for you, and it will help you in, you know, kind of readjusting your, whether it's readjusting your methodology or just trying to find new areas where you can contribute. So it all depends on, I think that's for me the most important part, is as long as you have a good relationship with your supervisor, it really shouldn't have too much of an effect on your work and stuff. And then they'd provide a lot of support for your mental health as well.
Thank you very much. So this is unfortunately all the time we have for the questions. We do have a mentorship scheme with the MRN. So any further questions, you can apply for a mentor, and then you can ask the mentor all your questions. So next we have a 5-minute break where you can stretch your legs. And then after that, we have our next panel discussion, where we aim to discuss the actions involved in actually enrolling onto a PhD, contacting supervisors, making a good impression in your interviews, and it should be a fantastic panel. So I will now pass over to Hira, who will introduce the break, and then we can go on to the next panel, inshallah, after the break.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I hope this was beneficial. So if you could just get up, stretch your legs. I know I need to. And then at 2:05, we'll come back and we will be joined by the next panelist. I will introduce the. Thank you. Salam, everyone.